Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 24th through 43rd verses of Matthew's 13th chapter. There are 7 parables expressed there, and 3 of them we're going to read and cover today, those being the weeds, the mustard seed, and the yeast. And then we're going to read an explanation, and we're just going to briefly cover what comes of it before in the 13th chapter to establish the found the momentum for our literary foundation. But it actually begins in the 12th chapter, where Joshua declares himself to be master of the Sabbath when he his disciples are taking grains from the field, which is legally permitted, but not by their interpretation of the Sadducee. And then he cast out demons and is subjected to a vicious smear campaign that he did this through the power of Satan. And then he exposes the logical fallacy of their argument. Then, he calls them a wicked and adulterous generation for seeking after a sign. No sign shall be given it but the sign of Jonah. So he just, called them wicked and adulterous, and warns them that the men of Nineveh and the queen of Sheba they're going to rise up, the men of Nineveh, because they had repented at the preaching of Jonah, and a greater than Jonah was in their midst. And for this queen of the south, Sheba, who traveled some 1,000 miles, a great deal by the standards of the day, to listen and hear and learn from Solomon's famous wisdom, and she comes away more than impressed. He was in their midst. She came from 1,000 miles away, and he was greater than Solomon. So he is at the war between him and the Pharisees had reached a breaking point. This is why he comes to rely on parables as a means of literary instruction. A parable is a device that uses relatable but fictional narrative events to express didactic truths in a way that is more lifelike than by expressed through general precept or abstract anything abstract doctrine. But in the content and the tone of we're just going to briefly read the parable itself. Verse 3, and he spoke to them much in parables, saying, See, the sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some indeed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. And others fell on rocky places, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered. And others fell among them, and the thorns came up and choked them. And others fell on good soil and yielded a good crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So read of 4 types of seeds and 4 types of scatterings, and one yields more abundant, the rest pretty much wither and die. So this is reflective as he explains the meaning to his disciples, who ask, why do you speak to them in parables, to the audience, the wider audience? And he tells them, it has been given to you to know the secrets of the kingdom of the heaven, but to them it has not been given. So they are privileged to his intimate access of the explanation of these otherwise undecipherable parables, and it's a good thing that the explanation is given after the first one we're going to cover today, because that's one of the things we'd have no way of knowing out without its explanation. But there is a dichotomy with spiritually sensitive people who can intuit and learn from these truths, versus those who could not, as is indicated by the field. And the agricultural field is going to form the analogy of all 3 parables. The ancient Israelites were an agricultural people, so these would have been relatable incidents to them. But then he quotes Jeremiah and Isaiah, and to highlight that dichotomy. You then hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes up and snatches away what is sown in his heart. That is sown by the wayside. So the wicked one is the one who is at war with Elohim, and he's against his kingdom and his people, and he wants to induce a spell. Ignorance renders any human vulnerable to his snares and deceptions. And then that sown on rocky places, that is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but is short-lived, and when pressure or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles. This is what is known as a fair-weather Christian. They're there when God's blessing them and all is well in prosperity, but then they abandon him when he kind of needs them most. Or when just any trial or form of persecution arises that separates the wheat from the chaff, just like that. And the sown on the that sown among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the worry of this ages and the deceits of riches choke the word, and it becomes fruitless. So all around us we have conflicting messages and conflicting forms of data that condition us and wire us to that which is of the world is that which is against the world, to simplify the comparison in its most but these are distractions, and the Christian must live in the world, yet not partake of its spirit or ethos or anything else, but live apart and above from the world by keeping their eyes above. And that sown on the good soil is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yield, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So that's obviously analogous to the making of more Christians. Disciples exist to make more of the same. And, the important thing is not the number. I think that Elohim rewards the effort and not the outcome. Case in point, Jeremiah, who preached effectively and faithfully for 40 years, yet he didn't, he barely converted a single soul to repentance. But now we're going to open with the parable, which opens the actual lesson itself. And again, it is agriculturally rooted, and some of the things we learned in the first, what we're going to learn in this is that Satan not only scatters seed, but plants weeds in the garden of that which is already grown and increased and fruitful. So no sincere Christian can he uproot, but those who are weak and weedy he can. And these are phony Christians that he plants in our midst that we have to coexist with because we are at war. We have a spiritual enemy who is trying to tear down everything we build up, and he does it from the outside, persecutions, and he does it from the inside by false Christians among us. So verse 24, in another parable he put before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven has become like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed darnel among wheat and went away. So he prefaces this the same way he prefaces all 6 subsequent parables. The kingdom of the heavens is going to be like, and that's Matthew's preferred term, kingdom of heaven. And once more, he's going to be, it's linked to the preceding parable in that it is a field. And there is good seed in the field. Now, the field is not the human heart, but it is the world. And as we're going to learn in his explanation, which comes circa verse 38. But other men are asleep, and if you are inattentive, Satan is our spiritual enemy. So this is about more than a farmer's field. This is about the warfare which exists between good and evil, personified respectively by Elohim and Satan. And when people get sleepy or lazy or inattentive, that's when he gets busy, and he's sowing weeds purposely in the garden of Elohim. So there's the authentic church, and then there's the people who kind of latch on to us who are inauthentic Christians. And Darnell translates as weed, and the enemy comes and goes. He is the prince of the air, the god of this earth. He scours the earth to and fro, so he knows that the field is representative of the whole world. So this field of ours represents its global and metaphorical dimension. And when the blade sprouted and bore the fruit, and the weed also appeared, so by your fruits they shall know them. Now, a weed is going to be instantly visible. That's one of the guidelines we are given in Matthew's 7th chapter to detect the false teachers, the heretics, those who would lead us astray, is by their works you will know them. And so good fruit obviously cannot bear fruit opposite to itself or bad fruit. So a good grape harvest will yield precisely that, what it is sown, grapes. So you reap what you sow. And but he reaped weeds for the purpose of destruction and compromising our collective witness. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? From where then does it have the weeds? So these servants have a question to their master, and it's how can this come about when you planted good seeds? We saw the growth and the increase, and then now there's suddenly weeds. Who put them there? How'd they get there? And the master of the house is analogously or metaphorically Elohim. He created the world, even though Satan is likened to the God of this world. He created it, and Satan cannot operate outside of his permission, but he does permit us to provoke challenges that can refine our faith. So these false Christians among us are necessary for, in fact, vital for our spiritual growth, how to deal with them. And it's a difficult and delicate matter. And he said to them, an enemy did this. And the servant said to him, Do you want then that we go and gather them up? So the man is the Son of Man, analogously Yahshua. He was divine and man, recognizes the enemy of his warfare. He recognizes Satan's activity for what it is. This is the enemy. And then the servants respond with a question, do you want me to gather up the good from the bad? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the weeds, you also uproot the wheat with them. So he doesn't want them to pluck out the weeds, because they run the risk of planting the wheat, which is fruitful and efficacious and performing its designed function and becoming what it was planted to become. These are representative of the sincere Christians who have the roots that the weeds lack, but their roots can be torn up through our misconcentrated efforts and energies. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest I shall say to the reapers, First gather the wheat and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my granary. So the purpose of the coexistence between good and evil is they have to temporarily coexist and reside on the same planet in the same neighborhood, but eventually they're going to be separated and permanently. And so he wants to keep them alive, give them every hour to repent, because it is, that within every human exists the theoretically unlimited redemptive potential, and he does give us as long a life as necessary to make a choice to come on him, and the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I'm sincere in that belief. I believe it is never too late to come as you are and be transformed permanently. If the thief in the cross was declared saved the very day that he was, I believe it's the same principle is applicable to anyone else. Not that deathbed confessions are the recommended route to heaven, but he made the most of his hour with the Savior and was declared saved that day for confessing out loud that he was sinless and that he expressed regret and remorse, and he had the sense that he deserved, he and the other malefactor, the other one who was pointing and laughing and mocking, mimicking the crowd's mockery, this other malefactor intervened and made the right decision that day. But another parable he put before them, saying, "The kingdom of the heavens is like a mustard seed, which means man took it in field, which indeed is less than all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is greater than the plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the heaven come and dwell in its branches." So this marks the distinction, the transition into our third parable. And it's prefaced the same way the kingdom of heaven is like, and he compares it to a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed as known in ancient Palestine, their farming communities and whatever you want to call them. And but we have smaller seeds, but the point is that there's a difference between the small seed, and it leads to the most widespread trees. So a mustard plant is a lot larger than the seed it comes from, and this is analogous to the seemingly insignificant beginning of the actually that's our other one, the seemingly insignificant beginning but the eventual global growth of the good news in the kingdom. And we are living and witnessing in an age of decline, yet we have the end time promise that the good news will be proclaimed throughout all the nations before that final day. Another parable he spoke to them. "The kingdom of the heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, until all was leavened." So customarily, yeast is usually associated negatively. The master himself compares it to false teachings in Matthew 16, 6 through 12. Their influence spread and grows much like yeast does. It puffs a bread from an otherwise flat matzah bread. If you've ever eaten it, it's flat, but yeast is what gives it its life and gives growth to it. And he compares that to also to as worldly compromise within Mark's Gospel 8:15. And that is, so you compromise a little bit with the world eventually leads to full-scale submission to its control and power and influence. The world is one of the Christian's 3 main enemies. The other is the devil in the flesh, the latter of whom is constantly trying to manipulate the middle of which to conform to the first. World, flesh, and devil, that's the ordinary. And he also compares it to hypocrisy in Luke 12:1. "Beware ye of the leaven or yeast of the Pharisee, which is hypocrisy." And he expounds on the hypocrisy of them all without singling them out and on name by correctly redressing some of the hypocritical religious practices prolific amongst the Pharisees in that day and age. They carried coins and give your alms in secret, let no one see, but the Pharisees purposely banged, they carried around coins with bangs. They made long, elaborate prayers, which were eloquent lip service to Elohim, but their hearts were removed from him, and they were praying in public to be praised and adulated by men. And so their devotion wasn't really to God, but to themselves. And also in fasting, they exaggerated the extent of their suffering. They'd beat their brows unnecessarily. So that's what he's warning against. But yeast in this passage indicates it's a symbol of growth. So the same life that gives rise to the bread is the there's a metaphorical force which propels the spreading of the kingdom to its eventual growth, and it's likened to yeast. And Yahshua said all this to the crowds in parables, and he did not speak to them without a parable. That's what we read of in Mark 4:34. By the way, I should have mentioned earlier that I cover the parable of the sower in Corey Johnston, Mark 4. You can get more details on that than that which I provided. It's a slightly different rendition of the same story. But remember, the reason that he's speaking to them without parables and not relying on them and resorting to them is because the intensity of the opposition that had mounted against this time. So parables, the ability to speak in cryptic language, could hide from his spiritual enemies that which they sought to entrap him by speaking cryptically and symbolically. That's why he was speaking to them without a parable. So that what was spoken by the prophet may be filled, saying, I shall open my mouth in parables, I shall pour forth what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. He's quoting the psalmist, Psalm 78, verse 2. This is a psalm of Asaph, where he's going to... Asaph is speaking of the duty to preserve the knowledge throughout the generations of the elders passing on to the instructors, but Joshua is claiming something a little different in emphasis in his appropriation of the original material. He is going to tell them what is hidden, what has been kept wrapped in mystery prior to his arrival and his revelation. Since the beginning of time, he's going to give them life-altering, historically profound revelation through parables. Then, having sent the crowds away, Joshua went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the wheat of the field. So they're asking him a question they had similarly asked him before to have these miracles explained, and he tells them what a tremendous... This is the second one, requires an explanation. So the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast are so seemingly self-evident, but there's a lot of unexplained, and I've barely even explained it myself. I've given hints and allusion, but I've been purposely saving the detailed description of the meaning because we reserve the right and prerogative to the author of the parable to give its correct interpretation and meaning. Everything we add is mere commentary. And he answering said to them, He who is sowing the seed is the Son of Man. So that's a self-reference. Son of Man was one of his divine messianic titles, and he is the sower of the seed. I guess the field belongs to the Father. And the field is the world, and the good seed. These are the sons of the kingdom, but the weeds are the sons of the wicked one. So, as I explained earlier, the field is the world. This is global in dimensions. This is more than a mere field. And in this field, this world, there is a dichotomy between the workers of good, identified here as the sons of the kingdom, and the weeds. They are likened to good seed. They are fruitful seed. They are a blessing and an abundance. They yield evangelical abundance, but the weeds are the sons of the wicked one. These are tools and stooges and slaves of Satan. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the messengers. So the enemy is identified as who I've been identifying him the entire time. He is speaking of Satan in cryptic language. Prior to this point, he refers to him as an enemy and a wicked one. I think that's the most, but he calls him out by name, the devil, that is Satan. That's what he is. Satan is who he is. And the harvest he's speaking of things yet to come, the end of the age, and they're at the beginning of the current dispensation. Since the inception of the dispensation of grace or church, the reapers have been the messengers. We've been the ones who have spread the message throughout the world and throughout the generations, chronologically and geographically. We are the messengers. As the weeds, then, is gathered and burned in the fire, so it shall be at the end of the age. The weeds are the ones who follow the wicked one, and if you follow him in his destiny and path, which is straight to the lake of fire, and then eternal torment in hell. And so burned in the fire is not an ordinary fire. This is the lake of fire. This is the fire of judgment, where lost sinners are sent who failed to repent in this chance they were given in this experiment, which life, which has eternal ramifications. So how we treat our years is truly an investment in eternity. The Son of Man shall send out his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all the stumbling blocks and those doing lawless. So the days of the phony Christians, the ones who claim to follow the good but in fact are stooges of the evil, will be recognized, uprooted, and discarded by the one whose name they claim to follow. So those there are stumbling blocks, individual and objective ones in the Christian path, and those doing lawlessness. Now, the disobedience is of no use or value to the one whose kingdom we are all trying to spread. And shall throw them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So that is their dreaded destiny and expectation in the furnace of fire, once more the lake of fire. There's going to be wailing. People are going to be screaming to get out and gnashing their teeth just intensely in response to the intensity of the fire, which is consuming them physically as they gnash their teeth. Then the righteous shall shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now he said that final phrase, who he has ear to hear, let him hear, formerly in the preceding passage, verse 9. So he has something to say that's important, and but the final thing he had just said before that is that the promise of being righteous and living righteously and having being clothed in his righteousness is to shine as the sun. That means the full radiance you're going to exude in attributes, supernatural attributes in the kingdom of their Father. So they are their sons and worthy and acceptable to be received as such when it is their Father. Now, every son of lawlessness and tool of Satan and the wicked one is also a child of Elohim, in that they are creations of him, but they adopt themselves and align themselves, the majority, with the wicked one. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.